Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome once again. We are, of course, moving on our global forum on responsible recruitment. And we are in this panel, having listened earlier on this morning in the opening session, are now going to be looking at fair recruitment. And in particular, what does it mean to have benefits for all within the context of fair recruitment? If you missed us this morning, my name is Nozipho Tshabalala, and it is an absolute pleasure to serve you as the moderator of this session. Now, in this session, we're going to be answering and tackling some very big questions that help us to make sense of what it means for us to really accrue benefits for all. We're going to look at how fair recruitment could benefit workers and benefit workers much more than it is right now. We're going to be looking at how we might extend those benefits to others throughout the recruitment process. In this conversation, we're going to look at how fair recruitment practices impact the functioning of labor markets. And of course, when we have unfair recruitment processes, how that too impacts the labor market. But also, one of the key themes that came out of the opening session was the importance of multi-stakeholder, coordinated, harmonized action. And so today, and in this moment too, we're going to be looking at how civil society, employers, and workers' organizations could contribute meaningfully to ensuring that we can begin to talk about and realize benefits for all. Now, I've got a panel standing by that is rearing to go and really excited about tackling these questions and getting into the conversation. But before I get to the panelists, allow me just to extend an invitation to you once again. We love hearing from you. We want to integrate your voice into the conversation. So please, if you're looking on your platform on the right-hand side of your screen, you will notice a Q&A tab. Please send us your questions, your comments, and myself and the moderators for the next 4 days are going to really try and integrate your voice into the conversation. You'll also notice that we have a social media wall. And that means that we can also share our reflections, our insights, the highlights that we are coming out of each session. And we're using the hashtag that you're seeing on screen right now, hashtag GFRR 2021. And if you put it up on the social media wall, I'm able to see it and we're able to all interact and engage with it. You'll notice a couple of other tabs. One of those, which is very important, is of course the global icon. Now that icon of a globe allows you to select your language of choice. We are translating into English and into French. So click the globe icon on your right, select the language that you'd like to follow this conversation in, and remember to mute your video player so that you are not hearing an echo while you are following our proceedings over the next 4 days. Last but certainly not least, if you stay on the portal, you will notice that you are able to actually see who has registered for this forum. You're able to make contact, exchange contact details, and even chat with other participants. So ladies and gentlemen, let's truly make this a global conversation. We have over 2,600 people that are registered, and let's make sure that we are touching every single corner of every stakeholder and every part of the world as we have this very important conversation. It's my pleasure now to introduce my panelists who are standing by. I'm going to start off with Mr. Islam. Thank you very much for being here, sir. Thank you for the wave. He is, of course, the deputy head of the Department of International Cooperation and Interaction with the ILO, and this is within the Ministry of Employment and Labor Relations in Uzbekistan. Thank you very much for being with us here, sir. We know, of course, Mr. Islam has also worked in the Embassy of the Republic of Uzbekistan in the Russian Federation, and he also owns a group of companies that specializes in export and import of textile goods. Moving on, we are joined by Madame Patricia Varinga-Giskes. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Job Factory. She did say that she think I'd have an advantage over her surname coming from South Africa. So I certainly hope that I've done it a little bit of justice, Patricia. And she arrived in the DRC in 2004. And this is after more than 15 years of professional experience in various fields in countries such as the Netherlands, Belgium, and South Africa. She then worked at the IOM in Congo as the deputy head of mission. And this is what actually inspired her to found the Job Factory, which is a recruitment, placement, and training agency, which she did in 2006. We look forward to your personal insights and experiences and your thoughts in the conversation, Patricia. Allow me then now to move on and to welcome Madame Teresa Wakubo, who is the head of Migration Domestic Workers Section. This at the Kenyan Union of Domestic Hotels, Educational Institution and Hospitable Workers. Teresa, thank you very much for being here. She's also the focal person for labor migration at the Central Organization of Trade Unions in Kenya. She's also the focal person for the Africa Trade Union Migration Network, as well as being the chairperson of the Women's Committee of the East Africa Trade Union Confederation. We look forward to your contributions, Teresa, and thank you very much for making the time to be with us. Ladies and gentlemen, last but certainly not least in this conversation, we're joined by Mr. Rob Godden. He is, of course, the co-founder of Rights Exposure. Now, Rights Exposure is a consultancy that provides communication solutions for non-profits. Before founding Rights Exposure in 2014, he worked in the Asia Pacific program at Amnesty International, which he did for 14 years while he was based in Hong Kong, Kathmandu, and London. And since 2010, much of his work has focused on the rights of migrant workers in the Asia region. Mr. Godden, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today. We look forward to tapping some of your insights. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I know that my panelists are rearing to go. I know that you're keen to hear from them, but so am I. But there is a very important voice that I think we need to pause and hear from in this moment. And so we're going to turn now to a personal testimony. And we're going to hear from Sushila Rai from Bushpa in Nepal, as she relates her personal story, her personal testimony that really lays the groundwork for the conversation we're about to have. Please turn to this testimony.
नमस्ते, मेरो नाम चाहिँ सुशीला राई हो, मेरो घर चाहिँ भोजपुर हो। हाल म अहिले जोर्डनबाट आएको। फर्स्ट हामी जाँदाखेरि चाहिँ आईएलओ प्रोजेक्टबाट गएको थियौँ। प्रोजेक्ट हामी फर्स्ट ब्याच हो। जोर्डन जानुभन्दा पहिला पनि म अरू ठाउँ कुवेत गएको थियो। कुवेत जाँदाखेरि चाहिँ पैसा तिरेर गएको थिएँ, इन्डियाबाट गएको थियो, नेपालबाट हैन इन्डियाबाट गएको थियो। फेरि कुवेतमा पनि 4 वर्ष बसेँ। कुवेत जाँदाखेरि चाहिँ 40,000 तिरेको थियो, जुन लानुहुने दाइले नै दिनुभएको थियो कि मलाई लगाइदिनु भएको थियो। अनि म गएको अब त्यति बेलाको त्यहाँको सेलेरी 10,000 थियो, नेपाली 10,000 हुन्थ्यो। 10,000 त्यहाँको जस्ट 5 महिनै भनौँ न, बिहासँग दिँदा ओर्दा 5 महिनै भनौँ न, 5 महिनै लाग्यो भनौँ न। पछि त्यसमा पनि मैले फर्स्टमा चाहिँ अब त्यो सबै तिरिसक्यो। त्यो तिरिसकेपछि चाहिँ घरमा मम्मी बुवालाई पठाउने गर्थेँ। बाट आएर मलेसिया गएँ। मलेसिया जाँदाखेरि पनि पैसा तिरेर जानु परेको थियो। मलेसिया जाँदाखेरि चाहिँ 85,000 तिरेर जानु परेको थियो। समथिङ त्यहाँको 4 महिनाको सेलरी भनौँ न तिरेर जानु परेको थियो। मलेसिया जाँदाखेरि चाहिँ कस्तो थियो भने, मलेसिया जाँदाखेरि चाहिँ मैसँग मेरै पैसा थियो, जस उता कमाएको पैसा अलिअलि मैले सेभ गरेर राखेको थियो। मलेसियामा पनि त्यस्तै फ्याक्ट्री होइन, कम्पनीमा यही मोबाइलको होइन, मोबाइलको त्यो भित्रको त्यो पार्टहरू बनाउँथ्यो। मोबाइल, ल्यापटप, त्यो सिसी क्यामेरा त्यस्तो पार्टहरू बनाउँथ्यो त्यहाँ चाहिँ। अनि ओरिएन्टेसन चाहिँ भएको थियो। अनि यस्तो ट्रेनिङहरू चाहिँ केही पनि भएको थिएन। जोर्डन जाँदाखेरि चाहिँ जो ट्रेनिङ हामीले 1 महिनाको ट्रेनिङ लियौँ, ओरिएन्टेसन लियौँ। जानुभन्दा पहिला चाहिँ जो हामी मेन पावरमा गएर थाहा भयो, बुझ्यौँ अब उहाँ कस्तो हुन्छ, के काम हुन्छ, सेलरी कस्तो हुन्छ, त्यो सबै बुझ्यौँ। त्यसपछि हाम्रो इन्टरभ्यू भएको थियो। इन्टरभ्यूमा पनि म सिलेक्ट भएँ। अनि त्यसपछि जोर्डन गयौँ। जोर्डन जानु पैसा लागेन, 1 रुपियाँ पनि पैसा लागेन। अब घरबाट अब जाने भाडासारा सबै हामीलाई म्यामहरूले नै गर्नुभएको थियो। अनि कामहरू पनि धेरै सजिलो भएको थियो। म्यामहरूले नै सबै कुरा गरिदिनु भएको थियो, सजिलो भएको थियो। जस अरू ठाउँ भन्दाखेरि अरू ठाउँमा चाहिँ जस अब आफैले गर्नु परेको थियो भने जोर्डन जाँदाखेरि चाहिँ म्यामहरूले सबै गरिदिनु भएको थियो, त्यही भएर सजिलो भएको थियो। त्यहाँ गइसकेपछि म्यामहरूले भन्नुभएको थियो सेलरी यति हुन्छ, 25,000, जो त्योभन्दा पनि धेरै हुन्थ्यो सेलरी चाहिँ। अब त्यहाँ बोनस आयो भने त्यो चाहिँ 30,000सम्म आउँथ्यो समथिङ। अब त्यहाँ 4 वर्ष भइसकेको थियो, गएको पनि 4 वर्ष भइसकेको थियो। अब नेपाल फर्केपछि पनि अब नेपालमा बसेर नि के गर्न सके हैन अब फेरि अर्कै कन्ट्री जाने भन्ने कोसिस गरिरहेको छु नेपालमा के गर्न सकिँदैन भन्नुमा पढाइ छैन पढाइ भएको भए त के गर्न सकिन्थ्यो होला आफ्नै देशमा त्यो पनि सोच्छ हैन एउटा कुरा अनि अर्को कुरा चाहिँ अब नेपालमै बसेर नि के गर्ने अब विदेशमा गयो भने नि अब अलिअलि के होला कि भन्ने परिवारको लागि बाबाआमालाई केही अलिकति सहयोग होला कि भन्ने आशाले चाहिँ गएको जोर्डनको पैसाले नि त्यही हो घरमा सबै घरमा अब बहिनीहरूलाई हेर्ने बहिनीहरू पढ्ने अब अहिले त झन् बाबाले काम गर्नै सक्नुहुन्न घरको स्थिति अब गाह्रो छ त्यही भएर पनि मलाई बस्नु मन लाग्दैन कि त्यो बाहिरतिर जाने अब घरतिर अब घरमा गयो भने नि म यो हेर्ने अब बहिनीहरूले अब हेर्ने उयो छैन त्यही भएर नेपालमा काम नपाउने भने जस्तो पाए पनि अब पढाइ चाहिन्छ भने जस्तोमा आफूले भने जस्तो खोजेर जस्तोमा पढाइ चाहिन्छ त्यो पढाइ हुँदैन नेपालमै अब सरकारले भन्नु सरकारले नै हैन अब सरकारले अब अरू वैदेशिक रोजगारमा जान नदिने अब आफ्नै ठाउँमा आफ्नै नेपालमा के गरेर खाने के अब जागिरहरू अब जस्तै उहाँ गएर हामीले गरिरहेको कामहरू पनि अब नेपालमै गरे भने पनि त्यो पनि त राम्रै हुन्छ.
And it's with great gratitude that we receive Sushila's story as she shares with us her experience. But a couple of the things that her story highlights, and I think it's important as we get into this panel discussion, she shows us what is the reality and what happens when the cost of recruitment is borne by the worker, which of course is one of the key themes that came out of this morning's session to say, we want a future where no fees are borne by migrant workers. Her story also reminds us of what happens when unregulated labor intermediaries operate outside of the legal framework, outside of the regulated environment. And that too becomes a very important conversation in the context of the next 4 days. We see through her story also what happens when low-skilled workers become prey for actors that are acting outside of the regulated environment. And we see her contrasted experiences of how she was exploited in one context versus the other. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, the central theme that comes out of Sushila's story is debt bondage, which is linked to the repayment of recruitment fees. We heard this morning from the Director General of the IOM how with the impact of COVID, we even saw migrant workers being subjected to debt bondage for jobs that they had already lost. And so the importance of this conversation of how do we accrue benefits for all becomes critically important. And so to my panelists, you've heard Sushila's story. And so I'd like to come to you now with this conversation. And Ismailov, I'm going to come to you first. And I want us just to maybe pause to reflect on Uzbekistan's commitment to fostering decent employment opportunities, in particular in the cotton sector, which we have noted has really been impressive and unparalleled. Your government has introduced major reforms in the space. It's undergoing large-scale transformation to make sure that workers in this sector are treated and recruited fairly and recruited ethically. The question to you very quickly, what would you say are the three most important measures that your government has taken into consideration in the design of the fair recruitment agenda for this particular sector?
Thank you for such a high assessment of Uzbekistan transformation. Since 2016, Uzbekistan has been rapidly developing in all areas, and especially in the sphere of labor. So what do we mean by a fair recruitment? It seems that we can describe it as a basic principles of what every self-respecting working person wants. So our government also taken measures like, first of all, we should be sure that a person should not perform any work under the force in general, or without desire, unless, of course, financial profit is at the forefront. Secondly, any work must be properly evaluated. It's necessary to take into account the amount of time and the severity of the work when drawing up the contract, in particular in the performance of such seasonal work, such as cotton picking. Third, for the full and high quality fulfillment of any work, it's necessary to encourage employees not only with decent pay, but also with the provision of a social package and guarantees to ensure the comfort and safety of employees. In pursuit of these basic norms described above, Uzbekistan is making every effort from year to year to carry out a successful reform in the cotton sector, which will serve not only to build a positive image in the international community, but also to ensure decent seasonal work with appropriate wages, providing a full range of services in the form of transportation to the place of collection, accommodation, 3 meals a day, and others. If you don't mind, I would like to describe some results in just 1 minute. We ratified Convention 29 of and protocol. Then in 2015, just imagine, the monitoring of forced labor showed a staggering figure of 448,000 people which were first to this labor. But in 2020, the figure was just 68,000, which suggests that this phenomenon nowadays don't have a mass character. In turn, I assure and I believe that in near future, we will even pass this figure to zero.
Thank you very much, Ismailov, for that. I mean, you've shared your 3 design principles. You've spoken about making sure that no workers are working under force. You've spoken about the importance of regulation. And you've spoken about not only decent pay, but a social package as well. But importantly, you've highlighted some of the benefits that you're already beginning to see on the ground. Maybe a quick follow-up question for you. You know, this conversation in this session is really about how do we involve other stakeholders in these reforms, and how do we make sure that these stakeholders benefit from those reforms. Can you give us a quick comment about how your government made sure that it was involving other stakeholders and how those stakeholders were benefiting exactly?
From the very beginning of cooperation with the ILO, International Labour Organization, the government of Uzbekistan has paid special attention to this organization and all the recommendations that it prescribes to its country partners. Talking about the cotton sector, the International Labour Organization was the first organization to declare its commitment to this idea, to the idea of our genuine reforms, and assured the government that the organization would make every effort to ensure decent work in this sector through multilateral support. Thus, as mentioned earlier, the ILO systematically conducts third-party monitoring to provide the government the real state of affairs in this sector. Over the past 5 years, regular consultations have been held with the involvement of international experts from the ILO and the State Labor Inspectorate for the continuous development of legislation and norms in the field of labor. In cooperation with experts of this organization, materials on decent employment, innovations in legislation, subsidies, and benefits in the field of labor are systematically developed, which in turn serves to raise awareness and legal literacy of the population, what is very important for building a free, democratic, and progressive society.
Thank you very much, Ismailov. So it's really good to see the consultations coming through, the input from global experts, the co-creation of those regulations that are context-specific and seem to be working in Uzbekistan. Patricia, let me come to you. I do want to bring the spotlight onto the private sector as I come to you, because if we pause to think about private employment agencies, we think about buyers, we think about brands, we know that all of these players have been now actively promoting the principle of employer pays or zero fees for recruited workers, primarily, one would say, in response to some of the global and local calls for action against debt bondage, against human trafficking, against forced labor. First question to you is, what has been the most significant impact of these principles on your business?
Well, what I would say that in the DRC and in many surrounding countries, the main impact of this has been the fact that now, from this moment on, people know that they can actually access work, that they can have a job without having to pay anything, without being someone specific, without being related to someone. They're just being hired and they're getting a job for the competencies. And that has made a huge difference, you see. And we've tried to sensitize people. We try to actually make this known, even through ILO, by the way. You see, we're still in the process, though, but that has made the main difference, is that people know that from now on, they can get a job without having to pay anyone to actually get a job.
Was the link to measures of success. Have you seen any success of these efforts on the ground? Have you measured any success?
Well, the main success that I can say that from a private sector point of view that we've measured is the fact that there are now more agencies. Okay, we negotiate more with the employers ministry. Okay, the labor ministry, and basically we've even asked for more control, because of course we're not going to lie to ourselves. There are always people that work fraudulently, but due to the fact that this has been a success and that we've measured it through all the agencies that are now available, we've actually asked ourselves that there must be some control on the field, on the ground, to make sure that it is actually being applied. We're talking about decent jobs here. And and like I said, ILO is kind of assisting also the government to do this, to apply this. But it's not easy, but they're trying their best, I would say.
I think that's a fantastic response, Patricia. And a quick final comment to you. For businesses that are still on the fence, what words would you have for them about really adopting these principles? How would you connect with them right now? What advice would you give them to really begin to adopt these principles?
Well, the advice that I would give to them would be actually come into the game, play like the rest. And you also have actually benefits out of it, you see, because that you want or not, when you're being fraudulent, it's always hectic. It's always a headache, because you're always going to have other fraudulent, I would say, administrators coming to you, you see. So it's really a headache. So you might as well want to avoid the headache by just being legal, by playing it as it should be, respecting the legal framework, and we actually all make it. And even for the population, it makes a difference, because then the agencies are also better understood. Because in the beginning, they actually had the impression that we were coming there to take off their jobs. You know, from the moment they would sign with us, then it's as if they've got no jobs or no contracts anymore. But in the meantime, they understood that we are actually there to promote their work, to make sure that they are treated ethically, that actually it's fair, that it becomes fair, that it becomes that decent work that we've been talking about and trying to promote, that the government is trying to promote too. So now they understand. I mean, that's what actually would make a difference to them.
Yeah.
You see?
Okay, fantastic. And it's as if you were in that opening plenary session where the Director General of the ILO was talking about a win-win-win situation, and that this is possible. I also think that your call to action to have less headaches, to sleep better at night, is certainly an argument worth paying attention to. Patricia, thank you for that. Teresa, let me come to you, because I know that the experience of domestic workers is one that becomes a very important example in the context of the conversations that we have. And we know that domestic workers comprise a significant component of the global workforce in informal employment. This morning, we were talking about vulnerable groups of workers, and domestic workers certainly fall into that group. And the majority of their work is without clear terms of employment. There isn't often any registration in any book or labor book, and they often are outside of the scope of whatever national legislation exists. So, first question to you, could you just briefly share with us some of the impact that some of your work has had on domestic workers in Kenya?
Thank you, Nozi. First and foremost, we have more domestic workers, including migrant domestic workers, currently being able to report violations to the union as a result of continued awareness creation on the workers' rights, ILO general principles and guidelines on fair recruitment, as well as the Migrant Recruitment Advisor. So far, we have over 350 domestic workers reviews that have been uploaded to the Kenya MRA web platform. This has enabled other workers to learn from the experiences shared on the Migrant Recruitment Advisor platform. It has also enabled Kotu Kenya to lobby government in the ratification of ILO Convention 189 and 189. The conventions, if ratified, will lay a firm ground towards protection of the rights of domestic workers, including migrant domestic workers. During this COVID pandemic period, we have also continued to reach out to distressed migrant workers to distribute sanitizers, masks, and foodstuff at the coast and Nairobi regions. This has been alongside other advocacy activities on safe labor migration and the use of technology. And finally, we have more migrant domestic workers getting organized into the unions in Kenya as a result of sensitization activities alongside other educational workshops. Thank you.
So sensitization, awareness, in sharing of information, workshops all seem to be one of the ways that we can really begin to change the conversation. Again, a key theme coming out of linking back to the conversation in the opening plenary. Very quickly, Teresa, in your experience, how can workers be empowered to gain greater benefit from their recruitment experience? Can we get that right for domestic workers?
Actually, workers need a well-organized pre-departure training based on the country of destination. Migrant workers need to know, or rather to have an idea about the culture, language, climate conditions, labor laws, and the expectations of their employers in the countries of destination. We also need to continue sensitizing workers on fair recruitment practices in relation to recruitment fees and related costs, employment contracts, working conditions, and pre-employment orientation, as most workers are not aware of them. Then there should be continued awareness creation on the national laws that govern migration and the ILO general principles and guidelines on fair recruitment. These will equip workers with indeed relevant information towards protecting them against exploitation.
Yeah.
Then we also need to equip workers with the use of technology. We have the Migrant Recruitment Advisor developed by ITUC and ILO Fair Recruitment Team. And this recruitment advisor, used alongside with other traditional methods, is going to be useful in collecting reviews from workers. The reviews then collected can inform governments about existing gaps in the labor migration governance, implementation, as well as be used in the formulation of relevant policies that would govern labor migration. Thank you.
All right. Teresa, thank you very much for that. I do want to quickly move on to Rob, but I think the points that you raised are quite important, because you're saying when we look at that pre-departure training, we've got to look at it from a policy perspective. We need to make sure that workers understand their rights, they understand their employment contracts, but also we need to equip them with some insights about the culture or the destination country they're going into, the language, the expectations. So it's both and not either or. Rob, as I bring you into this conversation, I'm keen to dial down to some practical examples, and I'd like you to give us some examples of what your organization, Right Exposure, is doing to promote fair recruitment practices, what you're doing to support the rights and the well-being of migrant workers and their communities.
Thanks, Nozi. If I may, I have a few slides. I can talk you through the phases that our work has gone through promoting and protecting the rights of migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong. If I could have the first slide, please. So when we, that's the last slide, I think. That's it. All right. So when we first begun to work in this area, one of the things we noticed was there was a lot of activism, a lot of organizing, but impact had really become flat. We wanted to understand what that was. So we did mapping and analysis of the sort of the ecosystem that nurtured and sustained that labor exploitation. And it was key to us that we built the strategy that came out with that with the rights holders, so working with domestic worker trade unions, but also within civil society to inform that as well, because there's a lot of knowledge there. And then you can build a critical path that really understands the phasing of your interventions. And that enhances your capacity to have leverage in the right places. If we go on to the next slide. And so what was really key then is once we understood that ecosystem was to be able to expose what the problems were. And that was really addressing the sort of the pillars, as we termed them, that the government used to defend that migration system. And so we needed to have a compilation of robust bodies of evidence that really addressed those pillars and showed where the system was broken. And that allowed us then to do strategic advocacy and to sort of increase our impact in regards to that sort of more traditional role of civil society. If I could have the next slide, please. And so then we move on to the sort of where we are now in many ways, which is the communication side of things. And we realized that there was only so far we could get as a sort of collective civil society in regards to the leverage we would have with the government and other actors. And so we needed to really, in some ways, recruit a more politically powerful constituency, and that was employers themselves, those who engaged the domestic workers to work in their homes. And for that, we needed to change the narrative. And that involved really looking at the problems and the participants and reframing it so that we could build allies. And so we did a lot more communications work in that regard. And then if we could move on to the next slide, please. And so once we had built that constituency with a more nuanced framing of the problems that affected the rights of domestic workers, we could then use that to look at how you reform the industry. And this is really understanding the motivations, the awareness levels and the priorities of the employers. And for example, why they engage a particular recruitment agency. So for the advocacy, we'd addressed the sort of the legal and a regulatory structure that the government built. But this phase is really about engaging the consumers, the clients of those agencies, and their role in building a more sort of ethical recruitment market. And that's where most of our work is focused now.
Rob, I think it's a fantastic share that you've given us. You've given us not only a timeline that sees the evolution of your efforts, but it's interesting to see how this is mapping back to some of the earlier conversations, from identifying the problem all the way to changing the narrative and even seeing some of those nudge mechanisms to begin to institute some behavior change. And I think it creates a fantastic framework for other civil society players and other stakeholders to begin to look at how do we bring about the desired change. Now, I have a quick follow-up question for you, Rob, and this is really looking at the extent to which civil society can really engage the private sector and regulators to build a market for fair recruitment practices. Is there something within our reach and that we could do with decent efficacy? Or is it something that's going to be a bit still out of reach in terms of its feasibility?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to look at that space where you have the employers, you have the employment agencies, and the workers, and civil society traditionally focused a lot on the workers and not so much on the sort of business and employers. And we saw our route really once we'd done the traditional advocacy and organizing and building of the structures that the workers use, to really look at the employers, because we saw them initially as being a constituency that we could help mobilize to put pressure on the government to reform the system. But the later phase is actually engaging with them about how they can reform the agencies that they work with. So if they're going to the agencies and they are demanding as a priority more ethical business practices, then we feel that that is a way of nudging the employment agencies into making those business changes. So you see we see it as a very holistic strategic approach, that it's not just one intervention which will affect this ecosystem. There's many things that actually sustain that labor exploitation, and so being able to engage with all of them. And so we hadn't traditionally engaged with employment and agencies, but we saw that we could work with the employers and try and get them to be an ally in regards to changing how the business practice of the agencies they work with.
Rob, I think that's great. I think the clear lesson for all of us here is to understand the ecosystem that the market is functioning within, but also then understand what are the levers that are available for you to pull on for systemic change, so that you're not fiddling at the edges, but you are really making systemic change. Now, one of the things I've promised my global audience is that I'm going to keep bringing their voices into this conversation, and that's exactly what I intend to do now. I'd like us to participate in a quick poll now, and there are 3 questions that I'm going to be putting to you in this poll, and I'm going to be revealing the answers very shortly. And let's first go to the very first question, and the first question is this: out of 164 million migrant workers worldwide, how many migrant workers are estimated to be subject to forced labor and trafficking outside of their countries of origin? Now, are we looking, is it 80 million? Is it 2.4 million? Is it 6 million? Or is it 12 million? So that's the first question I'm going to leave for you to respond to. The second question is this: out of 90 countries reviewed, how many have adopted policies prohibiting the charging of recruitment fees to workers and job seekers, according to the Global Comparative Study for a Definition of Recruitment Fees and Other Costs of the ILO in 2018? Is it 26 countries? Is it 82 countries? Is it 63 countries? Or is it 41 countries? Make your choice, and let's see how you do against those answers. Last but not least, when is the question, was the first ever global definition of recruitment fees and related costs adopted by a tripartite meeting of experts? Is it 2012? Is it 2018? Is it 2007? Or is it 2015? And that is the end of that poll. I'm going to pause there for a second before I ask the technical team to assist me by pulling up the right answers, and let's see how you have done against that particular poll. Well, I think that must be enough time for us to have gone through that poll. It's time to reveal the answers and see what those responses are. So remember that our very first question was, out of 164 million migrant workers worldwide, how many migrant workers are estimated to be subject to forced labor and trafficking outside of their countries of origin? And we see that 38% said the answer was 80 million. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the answer is not 80 million. The answer is 6 million. So for all of those who chose C, which is 16% of our audience, you get the prize for the first answer. And so that's the first question. Now let's go to the second question. Let's see what we've done. Remember that second question was saying, out of 90 countries reviewed, how many have adopted policies prohibiting the charging of recruitment fees to workers and job seekers, according to the Global Comparative Study for a definition of recruitment fees and other costs. Now, let's look at how we have done. The answer, interestingly enough, is not A. So 51% said it is 26 countries. The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is not D, which came in second at 41 countries. The answer is actually C, where 21% of us got this right. 63 countries have adopted the policies prohibiting the charging of recruitment fees to workers and job seekers. Last but not least, we asked the final question, which was, of course, in what year did a tripartite meeting of experts adopt the first ever definition of recruitment fees and related costs? And the answer, I'm very pleased to say, the majority of us got it right at 41%. The answer is B. The answer is 2018. So I hope you enjoyed that quiz. But most importantly, as we reflect on the responses to that quiz, is the invitation for us to really seek to understand the nuances of the complexity of the challenge that we are taking on, really understanding the detail, understanding the depth and the scope of the challenge that is ahead of us, of course, and the efforts that have been taken to date to try and address it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a lady who likes to keep my promises. I've also promised that I was going to be bringing in some of your voices through the question and answer portal that we have running on our platform. And so I'd like to bring a couple of questions to my panelists that have come from our global audience. I want to start off with the question from Oksana in Tashkent. And the question from Oksana is to you, Ismailov. And Oksana is saying this. She's saying, based on your experience with the cotton sector in Uzbekistan, what incentives do you think governments can use or they can apply to promote fair practice in large-scale industries or sectors? So what incentives can governments use or apply, Ismailov?
First of all, it's necessary to fully recognize the problems if they exist, without fear of the reaction of the public, the international community, and other institutions. Recognizing the problem is necessary to comprehensively consider all methods of solving this problem, taking into account the acceptability of both the state and the final consumer of reforms, the population. And furthermore, we should think about strengthening cooperation with international institutions, such as the ILO, IRO, the World Bank and other, which in turn will give access to a variety of successful models for solving the problem and a huge database. Always, government should follow the set course. And the most important thing is always to realize that the availability of access to the labor market, to open market trade, and the free choice of specialty, social protection measures for the employee, decent pay, as well as fair recruitment are among the most important elements for the development of the economy.
Thank you very much, Ismailov, because I think that response is really fantastic. And it's interesting, Rob, that you will hear the link back that Ismailov is started off with saying it's critically important to first understand the nature of the problem in your own market, and which is very much what we heard from Rights Exposure in terms of identifying the problem in the first instance. You've spoken, Ismailov, about the importance of strengthening international or cooperation and collaboration with international institutions. And I think it's quite important what you raise about being able to know which models have worked, the best practices that one can then begin to lift, so you're not reinventing the wheel in any way. And you know, you remind me of the work of James Clear, who talks about the humility to learn from others and not having the arrogance of thinking that every single problem is a brand new problem just because you've encountered it. And of course, you speak about the importance of having a bigger market picture in mind. So how do we incentivize in such a way that we are creating market opportunities? How do we incentivize in a way that is creating the required social protections while contributing to a stronger economic activity in the economy more broadly? So Ismailov, thank you for that response. And Oksana, I hope that you're happy with that response. I want to go then to Bangkok, where we have a question from Bharati in Bangkok. And the question is to you, Patricia. Bharati's question is this. She says, your agency has made progress towards fair recruitment in practice. What do you think regulators and employers can do to encourage other recruiters to abide by the same principle and promote change for the recruitment industry as a whole in the DRC? What do you think what do you think regulators and employers can do to encourage other recruiters?
Well, I would say, and that's one of my key takeaway points, I would say that awareness is the key element, you see, because eventually I am very much involved, okay? I'm very much involved in everything that has to do with ILO, because I do represent the private sector, etc. But it's not everybody of every agency in the country. The country is huge. You know, we've got a huge country. We around 85 million people, so it's a huge country. But I believe that awareness is the key. Awareness is key, and awareness comes mainly from indeed private sector. But I think that the ones that do regulate the market are government. You know, it's government. It's a Ministry of Labor that actually regulates the market, that gives information, and that gets people, agencies involved, you see. And I believe that is really key, because often governments tend to come and they are there to actually to kind of punish us when things go wrong. But what we also need is for them to come and tell us what to do, when to do, how to do it. Like I said, it's easy for me to talk because I'm very much involved, because I do represent the private sector at all the labor conferences and whatever, but it's not everybody. And I think that is really, really, really key, because even labor inspectors are not always aware of what should happen, what should be put in place. And that is also not normal, you see. So that's what I said at the government. But of course, it is all of us, our responsibility to actually do it. You see, that is why we try at our own level, we try to have some little conferences and these type of little forums to keep people aware. And actually, not to lie to you, just before you, I was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for such a conference. So, so we're just trying to keep things alive. But like I said, I think government is actually key. But at the same time, all of us at our own level need to actually come up with things, you see, come up with what information, awareness, once again.
Yeah. And I think you couldn't have underscored it anymore. Awareness, awareness, awareness. It is all about empowerment through information, empowerment through awareness. And I think you make a critical point about looking also at the role of broadening the role of government, that it's not just about enforcement and redress. It is about prevention. And that prevention is only possible through proactive action, which is possible because there's awareness and because there's information. It speaks squarely, Patricia, to one of our key themes over the next 4 days, which really looks at how do we better empower our workers. And I'm hearing you say through greater awareness. And so I want to go to France now. I've got a question from Ben. The question from Ben is for you, Teresa. Ben is asking, he's saying, how has the COVID pandemic affected domestic workers in Kenya specifically? Can you share a little bit of detail? That's from Ben in France for you, Teresa.
Thank you so much, Nozi. Actually, the nature of domestic work exposes domestic workers to working in other people's homes and sometimes in multiple of homes, and this exposes them to the risk of infection. Most women domestic workers are compelled to continue working despite the difficult times, just because their families depend on them for a survival. Some domestic workers have been declared redundant, while others have lost their jobs, simply because they are considered potential risks for contagion.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I wasn't sure if you intended to continue, but there was a background noise there, but not to worry. But thank you very much for raising some of those risks, because it speaks again to some of the issues we spoke about this morning about contagion. I mean, you're talking about perception, and again, one of the things that was raised in the earlier conversation was what is fueling the perception and the negative perception about migrant workers. Now, you will remember, if you were in the opening session again, is that the Director General from the ILO was very clear and unapologetic about taking on what he described as a toxic and negative narrative. And we heard, of course, from Madame Ray Lindsay saying that, well, that narrative comes from somewhere. And so we need to do more work about changing the perception about migrant workers. And in fact, when we do that, we're going to be able to see how this can be a win-win situation that benefits all. Okay, so Teresa, thank you for that. Let me go to Manila, where we have a question from Hussein. And Rob, I want to bring this question to you from Hussein. And Hussein is saying, well, there are many large global corporations in Hong Kong and in major cities across Southeast Asia. And the question is this: what role would you see them playing to accelerate change? And would you see any opportunities for collaboration with civil society in this area?
Thanks, Nozi. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and actually one that we're working our way through at the moment. There has been some engagement between civil society and those multinational corporations. For example, the Fair Recruitment Agency, working with those, they have a foundation, and getting these corporations to take a pledge where they commit to a sort of a fair recruitment standard and raise awareness amongst their employers about the situation in Hong Kong and how to engage a domestic worker with sort of more ethically. So that's sort of one example that I think we're now in a position to sort of build on and look at other ways that they can actually support and engage. So is there a role, for example, that multinational corporations can play in supporting and nurturing that ethical recruitment sort of business space? And one of the things is, and we get asked this question a lot, is so you tell us the problems, but which agencies can we engage? Which are the good ones? And I think without some sort of objective, independent verification system, then it's very difficult. And so is that something that, you know, taking the business experience of multinationals, that they could in some way support and nurture that as a way of building that sort of business environment?
So, Rob, I think it's such an interesting response that you share with us, because it actually links to something that Ismailov had started off with in this conversation as well. You're talking about independent verification muscle, and maybe that is one of the things that you could see really good progress that would accelerate change. And it speaks, Ismailov spoke about a database of best practice. And you're saying, look, in addition to that database, maybe we have an independent verification ability or capability. And that those two for me go completely hand in hand, because you start off with understanding what works. And then, of course, you have the ability to verify whether it's really working on the ground or not. Again, the Director General from the ILO this morning spoke about, exercising our authoritative muscles right into the household and making sure that you've got labor inspection efforts that are not at a high level, but that are really hitting the ground and beginning to look at what's happening even within the household level. Now, for this conversation, I'm very lucky to have 4 minutes left of the conversation. And so I'm going to really try and close off the conversation in a meaningful way. When we started off this conversation, we said that it's really about reimagining what fair recruitment that benefits all could potentially look like. And we've, in this conversation, heard a range of examples of what is possible and what has been done. I'd like to maybe close off the conversation by asking my panelists to all just reflect in 10 seconds or less. What is the one thing that you believe, if we got right in 2021, would fundamentally and systematically change the recruitment practice such that it is more ethical and it is more fair? Just one thing, one lever, that if we got this one thing right, it would have a knock-on effect in terms of helping us build the momentum required to really get more fair and ethical recruitment that benefits all. So I'm going to start off with, let me see which space looks like the most inviting for this question. Patricia, certainly you, let's go with you first. One lever, in your view, one thing we need to get right that you think could get us on the right track.
Being in this context, I would say that ILO constituents, so ILO stakeholders, which are workers, union of workers, private sector, so employers and government, need to join hands in an effort to continue awareness on fair recruitment and basically what decent jobs involved. That's what I would say.
Lovely. Awareness around decent jobs and fair recruitment. That was more than 10 seconds, but I will forgive you. Ismailov, let me come to you next. In 10 seconds, one thing that you think would have a meaningful impact if we got it right today. You're muted, Ismailov, so I can't hear you right now.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
From jobs to freelance, from our job places to the IT and internet. I think this is the future, and the COVID-19 confirmed that this tendency.
Thank you very much, Asmalov. So you're hurtling us into the future, and you're saying from jobs in the traditional sense to a freelance economy that is based on the internet, that's what we need to be getting right so that we can tackle many of the issues we're seeing today. Teresa, let's get a quick comment from you in 10 seconds. What do we need to get right in 2021?
We, the workers, have a right to fair recruitment. And this cannot be realized without equality and inclusion of all workers, including migrant workers, and without a fair recruitment process. So government has to provide clear requirements in law and regulations for fair recruitment.
All right, Teresa, thank you. Equality and inclusion for fair recruitment. And then finally, Rob, I think you get to take us home in 10 seconds. What do you think we need to get right?
I think we need to have a deeper understanding of the motivations and needs of employers, and then be able to communicate with them more effectively.
Fantastic. So Rob is inviting us to sit in the problem a little bit longer and really have a deeper understanding towards the needs of employers and why they then engage with those needs in the way that they do. Lots of thought, lots of provocative insights, lots of really meaningful insights, but a call to action from each and every one of you for us to really think about how we need to reimagine recruitment of migrant workers so that there are benefits that are accruing to all. Thank you very much to each and every one of you for joining us for this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, our global conversation continues. Do join us at 2:30, that's CES2 at 14:30, where we're going to be looking at a conversation on improving regulation at all levels to drive progress. For myself, Nozipho Tshabalala, here at the tip of the African continent in Johannesburg, it's been an absolute pleasure being with you today. For now, it's goodbye from me, and we'll see you at 14:30.